I'd like to introduce today a very special guest. We have Brian Solis. He's the principal analyst at Altimeter. He's a speaker, he's a thought leader, and he's an influencer in his own right. And many of you are familiar with him. Thank you, Brian, for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody.
So Brian, to get started, I know you've been studying influence since the 1990s, and really early days as this was just taking off. Would love to understand what got you interested in the space.
Yeah, so basically what Eric is saying is that I'm old. I started, and this is actually true, I started studying digital influence in 1996 and 1997 when it was just message boards and forums and early things that we used to call web blogs. And the reason is because it was such a tremendous time in the consumerization of technology that traditional media didn't work as well to create markets. So I was working with a lot of startups at the time because it was the dawn of Internet 1.0. And the thing that was so remarkable about that time is that startups are not, if anybody has ever worked with a startup, they're not like a normal company. So they don't have budgets, they don't have patience, they need everything now, and they need to invent and create markets overnight to appease investors and, of course, grow the business. And so we found that what was happening online, like you were talking about with peer-to-peer trust and influence and validation, seemed to be a faster path. So not only was I studying it in the 90s, I was also helping invent what would become influencer relations back in the day. And that just blossomed over the years with Web 2, social media, and I just recently stopped studying it just last year because I feel like the space is there's so many smart people in the space now, I don't need to be in it anymore.
We still need you in the space. I would love to understand more about Influence 2.0. That's something you talk about quite a lot. And how does it differ from Influence 1.0?
So I think what happened with the dawn of early digital influence, and it's still pretty much pervasive today, is this idea of find the people who have a lot of followers, who trend against certain tags or keywords, and then put your product in their hand and go. And try to do as much of that as you can with as much budget as you have. But the reality is that that's no different than any form of traditional marketing or advertising. That's just putting stuff in front of as many people as you can and hoping that there's resonance. And we put metrics around that stuff to make it look like it's really effective, like how many people follow that person, how many impressions or views did that particular post get. But in reality, when you think about what you were talking about, when we as human beings go online to share what our experiences are, or to see the experiences of other people, or to do any kind of research about what to buy or what to do or where to go, there's a real human connection there that happens that I think we take for granted or that we miss. And so the difference is with Influence 2.0 is actually trying to plug into that human journey. So when I want to take a vacation, I'm going to do all kinds of research. And I need to find the people and the content that are going to align with me at every step of that journey, even after that trip. And Influence 2.0 was trying to find creators that will help guide that journey for people to make decisions. I'm not saying you have to replace Influence 1.0, but I'm saying that what we live in today is an era of too much noise, too much content, and people just actually need help and direction and relevance. And so the more that we can work with influencers to create that assistance along that journey, the more you help that influencer gain authority. And you also, that whatever product you're working with, or whatever brand you're working with, becomes benevolent. And also there's one of the biggest things in influence that I learned is reciprocity. So when someone feels like there's value in an engagement or in a moment, you feel thankful and you express that thanks either in interaction or engagement or community or networking or a purchase.
And when I started out, influencer marketing was very transactional, right? You'd work with an influencer. It was, hey, go post this, take a picture. We don't really care what the content looks like. How many followers do you have, right? And they were essentially buying influencers by the pound. You have a term that I really like, which is pay and spray. I would love to understand how in Influence 2.0, content and creative factor in to that customer journey and that brand experience.
I'll have to share with you the deeper answer to that question so that you could share it with everybody. But I put together what I called the context journey. So what a consumer journey looks like today, and when they're open to influence, and what those key moments are to create certain types of content that would help them take the next step along that journey. And it's really intentional. I'll tell you, as an influencer, I get pitched all the time to come on to programs, and the number one thing that I see in every request isn't anything about the consumer or understanding their journey or understanding where they are or what they need or why. It's about, can you say and do these things on brand against our message style guide? And look, at the end of the day, it's still very much transactional, but it's not gonna, I always have to turn it down because I want to build my community. I want my community to still trust me and kind of still follow me and believe in my work. And I can't do that if I can't be authentic. And to be authentic, I have to understand who I'm trying to reach and what's valuable to them. And look, at the end of the day, that reciprocity is what I used to talk about in terms of the 3 R's of influence. One was relevance. Yep. The other one was resonance. How long can that piece stay alive and be useful? And the other one was reciprocity, which was, can you make that content trigger an emotional reaction that begets something human?
Yeah, and looking at trust, right, and how it factors into the equation, what are some common mistakes you've seen brands make, or general advice you'd give to a brand in making sure that they're doing a good job building trust when engaging with influencers?
How much time do we have? I think the biggest mistake that we all make, because it's easy to get caught up in the glamour and the popularity of all of this stuff. I mean, it's whimsical. It's wonderful. I once said that the best thing about social media is that it gave us a voice, because everybody's an influencer now. The worst thing about it is that it gave us a voice. And we took for granted this idea of popularity versus building communities where there's that value and that reciprocity. So the biggest mistake that brands and marketers still make today is getting caught up in that and not realizing that on the other side of the screen is another human being. And the game is about longevity. The game is about building value. I actually believe that what this is really about, and what most brands miss, is actually making the brand an influencer instead of building off the backs of the social capital of other influencers. You use it to build a community where everybody together grows and flourishes. To do that, you have to understand the customer, or you have to understand the ultimate audience or the ultimate human being and what's important to them. What's a day in their life look like? Do you know that your customer looks at their phone something like between 1,500 and 2,500 times a week, adds up to about 4 hours a day. And in those moments, you have a gift of attention, and we have to figure out ways to use it, because if not, they're completely distracted. And with that distraction, the consumer actually feels, and a lot of this is subconscious, a ton of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of pressure for themselves to keep up with their social networks and to keep feeding their content, and then also getting mindlessly, I call it the endless scroll, where you just get caught up scrolling content for no good reason. All of that stuff is changing how your consumer engages. And I think that brands aren't spending the time to think about what that moment could look like. Back in the day, I wrote a book called Engage, and it was really about thinking, when you have this audience and you can get their attention, what are you going to do with it and make it meaningful? And now I use the word embrace, because I want to make it more intimate. I want to make it more, not just more human, but personal. And the data exists now, thank goodness, with all of the mobile devices and social networks that we use, to understand the people behind that screen in order to partner with influencers and create the type of content that's going to be resonant, that's going to be helpful, that's going to be unforgettable, that's going to be special. Because at the end of the day, you want the human network effect to take place, which is, it isn't just about the influencers, it's about how that content stays alive and shared throughout the networks.
And a lot of brands, especially brands in this audience, are really focused on ROI, right? How do I get return on my investment working with influencers? But you're talking about building meaningful connections, and that takes time. How do you see measuring ROI when it comes to influencer marketing?
I used to, well, I still do this. I say that ROI when it comes to any type of marketing, but the same is true for innovation or digital transformation. Everybody wants to know what the ROI is. And so I'll always say, well, what's the ROI if the I stands for ignorance? What's the return of not doing anything or doing things the wrong way? What I like to do with Influence 2.0 is change the metrics. With Influence 1.0, which I think you still need to do because there's, popularity is still a good thing. Guilt by association, if you have, cool people representing you, that's good too. But Influence 2.0 lasts longer. And in those types of metrics, we're looking at things like customer lifetime value. We're looking at the value of a customer in a moment. And we're creating the type of content and the types of engagements that trigger those outcomes. So when you change the game, like any startup, you can measure where that investment's going to come from and how you're going to deliver it back now and over time. And some of the metrics at the beginning are soft, but in the point of Influence 2.0 was showing that hard metrics are actually possible.
Yep. And thinking about today's world, right? Everyone has one of these in their pocket. Everyone's essentially an influencer now, right? How do you measure or determine who an influencer is and what is influence?
Yeah, okay, so I could share a report that you could share with everybody. Back in 2012, I wrote a whole paper about that. What is digital influence? And to kind of sum it up, I had said that influence is not popularity, and popularity is not influence. Just the textbook definition of influence is to cause, affect, or change behavior. And I take that pretty seriously because if I'm going to have the gift of your attention, I got to really think about what I want to do with it and how is it going to yield something back so that whether it's a brand or whatever it is, that there's value in it for everybody involved. The thing about influence is that essentially you're borrowing the social capital of somebody else who's built that social capital within the community. And so it's like a transaction. So you have to give them something for it, and they have to give their audience something for it, and the audience has to get something for it as well. And it's a value cycle. So the idea of influence is really about causing these effects and changing behaviors in positive ways that everybody feels good about. I'll give you a quick example. I don't know if you know this, but back in the day, it's funny to be in this neighborhood. I used to have a business partner named Ashton Kutcher, and we did a lot of really cool influence campaigns with all of his celebrity friends, like Oprah Winfrey, and we did stuff with the United Nations. And one of the projects we did was to raise the awareness of malaria in Africa, which we wanted to spread the word with millennials because it was becoming a forgotten thing, that it's actually still a real issue. And I think the goal was to, of course, raise awareness. The second goal was to get people to donate $10 for a bed net because that's still the most effective way to fight malaria. And in the first, I can't remember, like 48 hours, we had something like 400,000 unique mentions of the campaign. So check, raising awareness, did that. But I think we had 88 donations out of 400,000 mentions. And I studied why that, and this is real time because you have to go, and I studied why is it that we had so few conversions for bed nets? And the answer was because everybody thought that they were an influencer. Everybody believes that they're an influencer. So their response was, oh yeah, I shared that. You're welcome. I probably got you 3,000 bed nets donated. And when everybody thinks that, no one's actually taking action. So you have to change the content and the strategy to trigger the effect that you want in influencer marketing. And we did it right away, and it worked.
And did you do that by essentially changing the call to action from, hey, I'm not only going to share this, but I'm also going to donate as well?
Yeah, one of the experiments was reverse psychology, which was don't share this, just donate. And then, of course, everybody shared it and donated.
Yeah, it's funny how that works, right? When you're talking about social capital, the idea of people actually feeling like it's more valuable for them to give back their social capital rather than the $10 for a bed net. Did you feel like were you seeing like everyday people as well sharing it through all the way down, and were they seeing good engagement from their audiences as well?
Yeah, because then you turn it into a movement, and you activate social proof. In fact, one of the things that I can't emphasize enough, and I said this back in the day, and I still see it shared today, which is fantastic, is that social media is less about technology and more about sociology and psychology and anthropology. And what we're really talking about is human-to-human engagement. And social proof is a big deal in this. And if you can activate social proof where people feel like better for being part of this, then you can have great things. But to do that, you have to understand the psychology of what it takes. Long story short, back in this time, I can talk about it now since these times are super interesting. I wrote a paper for the Department of Defense about how social media can be used to positively influence constituents to get more involved in politics, to get more involved in voting, to kind of shape democracy in the most positive direction. And it's funny to see that 12 years later that the exact opposite has happened. And the same techniques that are used today by fake news and bots is essentially psychological warfare. They're doing the same things, but on the negative side that you can use on the positive side to trigger a great reaction, to create social proof, to gain social capital. And that social science of influencer marketing is something that is awfully absent in this, is understanding if you think about what the word experience means, it's actually an emotional reaction to a moment. And you express that reaction in a series of outcomes, expressions, what have you. And that's the part that we have to think about, is that when I have that moment, what am I going to do with that experience so that I can trigger the type of reaction that we all feel better for, or to trigger a BedNet donation or what have you. The psychology of it is too often missed. And in the best cases, you see, not just with influence, but just market creation, you have anthropologists that are on staff helping to understand the culture and the norms of engagement.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, right? When we talk about storytelling, essentially, when it's used for the wrong reasons, politically, it's called propaganda, right? And by just changing a call to action, in this example, you completely change the reaction. And I guess I'd love for you to share a little bit more around storytelling and the importance of storytelling.
Well, one thing I should tell you is that in the 90s, I did become a digital anthropologist. That's how serious I believe all of this is to not just marketing, but just influence as it relates to just shaping the world in as positively as possible. Storytelling is interesting because everybody wants to be a storyteller. I hired, his name is Nick Sung, and he used to be a Disney Pixar storyboard artist. And I hired him to teach me the art and science of storyboarding, because in there lies the magic of storytelling. And I have to tell you that it is not at all what I thought it was. I thought storytelling was, let's make a great story, let's make some really compelling content, let's make it shareable, let's work with, even myself as trying to be a storyteller, let's make it as engaging and as compelling for the audiences. And no, it's actually, a very psychological and emotional thing that you design for. And if you've ever heard of the hero's journey, there's real techniques to how to engage someone and strip them of that anxiety and make them smile in that moment and remember what you want them to remember at the end of the day.
So it's more of a science than an art.
It's an absolute science, and that's the art of it. And the art of it was compelling. And Nick Sung, if anybody cares, he's available. He now does this full time, and I found him because he had famously done work with Airbnb. Maybe you've heard of that company. At 4 years old, Airbnb was going through an existential crisis. I don't know if you all remember, but there was a time where all of the news on Airbnb was about porn parties and drug parties and trashing homes and weird hosts. And they realized that they had a problem, and part of that problem was the Airbnb story. And so they took all the data to understand their host journey, their visitor journey, and they hired Nick Sung to essentially storyboard the data, because no one could really understand what was happening behind the scenes, how the company lost control of its brand. And he famously, through those storyboarding techniques, were able to turn the science of data into a story that everybody could get behind. And that was when Airbnb went through that whole famous rebranding, because everybody understood what the Airbnb story could be.
And that's what really allowed the brand to stick and
that's what it
reshift.
sucked. Absolutely, because they understood their people, and they understood the host needed to see a certain story, and the ideal guests needed to see a certain story.
Awesome. Well, I feel like we could talk for days about this. I think we're out of time now, but I want to thank you, Brian, for joining us up on the stage. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.